All right, what's going on, guys? Today we're going to do a deep dive into the two postural presentations that you'll typically see from most bodybuilders. We're going to cover kind of what the differences are, why it matters, and how we can actually address them. So I've been doing these scrolling through IG vids. They're really fun. I like to have fun with those, but I figured it was time to drop some education bombs. So maybe this one won't be quite so entertaining, but I'll try to make it not so boring. But it's really good information that'll help a lot of you guys out there. So I'm going to be using PRI terms, postural restoration terms, for these presentations, but it's just because that's kind of what's most familiar with a lot of people. There's different terms for them, but I'll show you what they really look like. But I'll be referring to them to as the left AIC pattern and the pec pattern. Okay, so first let's talk about the left AIC pattern, because that's where everybody starts from. And we're all biased towards the left AIC pattern. That's not a bad thing, but it becomes an issue whenever you can't get out of that pattern and you can't get onto the other side. And there's a reason everybody kind of defaults to this a little bit, and it just has to do with managing like forces internally. It has to do with your organ setup. You have a bigger diaphragm on the right, you got your heart there, your intestines is set up a little different, and it even comes into play with like how your brain works. Your left and right brain operate differently in your eyes. So for a multitude of reasons, we're going to be biased towards kind of staying on our right side and feeling more secure there and wanting to get off of our left. So I'll show you what that looks like using the pelvis model a little bit for the hips. When we're in a left AIC pattern, and that just stands for left anterior chain, it's talking about what's called a polyarticular chain of muscles, and it's a group of like, I forget how many muscles, like 7 muscles or something, that are so intertwined through connective tissue and fascia that like when you dissect them, you can't really separate them out. So they really impact each other. So one thing can really affect something further down the kinetic chain. So if we look at the pelvis, a left AIC is gonna have a little bit of that externally rotated left hip. So it's gonna be a little forward and out, okay? And then this left innominate bone is going to be sitting back in a little more internal rotation. Okay, so this femur on the left is going to be a little externally rotated, and this femur on the right is going to be a little bit more internally rotated. So on the right side, we're going to tend to have really overactive hamstrings just because of the position of this right innominate bone. The hamstring is going to be a little bit more shortened. It's going to be in a position to provide more stability. You're going to have more activation from your adductors, and then from your hip internal rotators like your anterior glute mid. And then on your left side, you're going to have a really overactive like posterior glute mid fibers and just like external rotators as well. And it's really important to take notice what happens to the sacrum when we're in that left AIC pattern, right? Because it's going to be slightly turned to the right. And remember, anything I ever show you guys with the pelvis is greatly exaggerated. There's not that much motion that goes on. It's just so you can kind of understand. It's really subtle. So the fact that your pelvis is kind of offset like this, it's going to have an impact on your upper body as well. And that is what we call a right BC pattern. So you'll see a left AIC pattern paired with a right BC pattern. So let me show you what that looks like. Okay, so here, this is Connor Harris. If you're not aware of who he is, he goes really in depth with this stuff, a lot more than you'll probably see me. Great information. I've taken his course before. It was not like crazy advanced. I'd already learned like most of this stuff, but it was a good review. But if this stuff is totally new to you, it's actually a really good course and can really help you understand this stuff a little bit better. So what it's demonstrating here is an exaggerated version of what a left AIC pattern will look like. So you can see the pelvis is kind of like I was talking about. It's also turned to the right as well. So typically you'll actually have an orientation that way as well, actually. So we have that, and then it tends to just turn a little bit as well. So we have that pelvis turned to the right, and you can see these ribs are flared up. That shoulder is going to be higher. These ribs are actually internally rotated coming down, and the sternum is turned to the right. So it's kind of like we have this rotation in our sacrum that turns us to the right. So we have to like flare these ribs and try to open up that way, or we're just going to end up like walking around in circles, right? You also notice the head as well. So typically you'll be a little offset like that, and the left side of your neck will be a little shortened, and then you also have really tight like right SEMs, and there's also something called the right TMCC pattern that goes with this as well, that goes into like the cervical spine and your jaw and your cranial bones and muscles. That's a little in depth for what we're trying to do, but that can have a huge impact on a lot of things. That can actually change the shape of your face. You can make your one eye smaller than the other, kind of make like your left ear flare out more. And here's a picture of the backside. So there's that right sacral rotation that I showed you on the pelvis, but right here at the thoracic lumbar junction, like T12 area, we actually have that counter rotation to the left I demonstrated. And so part of the TMCC pattern actually has another rotation up here at the cervical spine to the right. So that's why it's harder to turn left with your head normally. We're already kind of skewed to the right. And here is what happens with the scapula. So we're going to have this left side of your scapula is going to be closer to the spine, and this medial border is going to be closer to the rib cage. So on the right side is more likely to be winging than the left, and that's because of the depressed rib position. And we're going to have it further away. So you can see, like, if you have this setup, how it could contribute to some potential muscle imbalances, which could also contribute to some like minor aches and pains and injuries potentially if you keep working out with those imbalances. So some common issues you may experience if you are in a pretty severe left AIC pattern is it's very common to get left outer knee pain or IT band pain on that side. I would say like right QL is another common kind of injury or issue that people tend to deal with. Now for me personally, I fall really heavily into a left AIC pattern, and part of that is just how I've worked out my whole life. I was always like pretty aware of how good it felt to keep a stack. And so when you keep a stack, you're not going to tend to flare and go into this extreme arch, which is going to lead to the pec pattern, which we'll check out in a little bit. I was always more likely to have like a compensation from like a lateral shift or something. And another reason I tend to fall really heavy in the left AIC pattern is because I had an injury to my left knee whenever I was in high school. Played football for 5 years, never got hurt, and then my junior year I'm just running on the practice field and fucking tripping a hole and twist my knee. And I grew up pretty poor. Like I didn't get fancy things like health insurance, and so I never got it fixed at all. So I was like fucked up for a couple of years, and that really, it was on my left knee, so it pushed me even more to my right. So I'm really in the left AIC pattern, a lot more than most people. Most bodybuilders will present more of what's called pec pattern. And so let's check that out. All right, so let's start with the pelvis presentation of the pec pattern. So like I said, everyone is biased towards the left AIC. We're always going to be a little bit biased towards one side. And again, that's not a horrible thing. If you can get out of that, it's good. And we need to be a little biased like that to start the propulsive gait cycle. So when we become pec pattern, this usually happens because you're producing a lot of force and you're going through extension to do that. And so we start with the kind of left AIC pattern, and then as we continue to work really hard to be a big force producer, we start to flare even more. So it's like we're still going to be slightly wider with this left one, but now our right one is no longer in that internally rotated position. It kind of looks more like what the left looks like. The left is just more extreme, and you can see the spine dumps forward more. It's not quite as rotated as a left AIC, still like very slightly, but now we have this pelvis all dumped forward. A lot of times pec pattern people are going to present with that flared rib cage and duck feet. They're going to have really flared out feet because of the way their innominate bones are flared out, that their femurs have to turn out. So as you kind of get more and more here, these turn more and more as well. So you end up walking around like a duck. And everybody's like on a spectrum. Most of you guys are going to fall into a pec pattern, but you're still going to have some asymmetries and be lateralized. Just not as much if you're full AIC. And what you'll notice later as you start doing the things to fix yourself, you might actually get more asymmetrical as you take away some of the pec pattern layers. And that's actually a progression. You got to get rid of the pec and get to a basic left AIC before you can really fix your underlying issues. So, you know, the dump forward pelvis, and now I can use my fancy $450 rib cage that I can't believe I spent this money on. So do me a favor, if you feel like this helps you at all, the visual, please leave a comment and thank me for the rib cage so I can feel like I didn't waste all my fucking money on this. So we have the pelvis is dumped forward. Now the rib cage on a pec pattern is a little different than the rib cage on the AIC. So remember, on the rib cage here, we have it kind of flared out on one side and the other side's internally rotated, and it's kind of like asymmetrical. When we're in a pec pattern, we're really looking at compression from A to P. So this is like our normal rib cage position. If you're in a pec pattern, you're walking around just squished front to back. And you can't really represent what a left AIC would look like, but it would be like squished like on the right to the front and squished on the left to the back. So we would have like expansion in the left front, expansion in the right back. We'd be kind of like crooked. Whereas the pec pattern, we're just squished. Everything's squished, and these low ribs sometimes kind of flare out a little bit. So here we have Connor kind of giving us a visual presentation of what I was showing you. So you can see we're gonna have really tight erectors, really stuck in extension. The pelvis is usually going to be dumped forward. Now you might not present like this. Most of you guys will, but you can still have an anterior tilt and not be there. Your pelvis can be pushed under, and you can have a flatter looking back. All this stuff would still apply to you. You just might do like very slightly different positional things. And so we have this lumbar pushed forward, we have the hips dumped forward, and we have these ribs flared out. They actually should be pretty compressed too. And this is your body's way of adapting to producing a lot of force. You put high demands on it, and you're not super hyper aware of your stack and your pelvic position. This is what's going to happen. And if you're a power lifter, this is kind of how you have to walk around to perform the range of motion with the kind of weights that you do. But as a bodybuilder, this is not optimal. It's not going to lead to good aesthetics. Now, one thing to notice in the pec pattern, you can kind of tell everything's pushing forward. So if you're in a pec pattern, your center of gravity is actually a lot more forward. So that's something we have to address, whereas on like a left AIC, it's not really forward. It might be lateralized on the right side. So you just got to get over to the left, but on a pec pattern, essentially you have to bring it back and then get it over on the left. So it's an extra step. So we think about the muscles that we really need to help with this pec pattern. We're going to want like internal obliques and deep transverse abs to get these ribs to drop and this pelvis to come neutral. People in a pec pattern have really overactive rectus abs. They're outer abs. They put everything through there instead of letting the deep ones actually control the rib cage and spine. We're also going to need to get your low back to chill out and get your hip flexors to chill out. So we really want to fire up some upper hamstrings. It's gonna be really important to get that upper hamstring area to get this pelvis to pull back. And then also when you walk around in a pec pattern, you're gonna have super tight lats. It's gonna be really hard to get a stretch on your lats. It's gonna be hard to develop delts. It can really affect your aesthetics negatively. And we're gonna go through examples of bodybuilders with both types of presentations in a second. So pec pattern people typically deal with more back pain, like spine and neck, cervical stuff, than the left AIC people. And they also can just have a lot of issues anywhere. Like a lot of times they don't have internal rotation at all on either shoulder, so their shoulders hurt. Typically it won't be like lateralized left knee pain. They might just feel patellofemoral pain, like general around the kneecaps. A lot of times they'll get like wrists that bug you. They just have like more kind of wonky things that go on. And so probably like the first thing to address these issues is to be aware, because what happens is we get stuck in these positions. That's what we're just chilling in all day, no matter what we're doing. And when you're in these shitty postural presentations, and then we take tons and tons of breaths in that position, we reinforce kind of where we're compressed and reinforce our issues. So there's a lot of times where we kind of will fall into our pattern and get comfortable and not realize it. And that will reinforce a lot of the issues. Like for me personally, I don't have any issues hardly in the gym, but when I'm doing other things, I tend to get thrown out of whack way more. So like driving, for example, this is a big one for me. So when I'm driving, I'm heavy on my right side of my ass. I got my left arm across my body. So this is really reinforcing a left AIC pattern. Essentially, I'm shortening my right side. I'm keeping my ribs down. Everything should be the opposite. And what I'll do is like, I'm thinking about like, oh shit, I will literally switch to the opposite. I'm like, oh man, this feels weird. But yeah, this can be a big issue. Like I took a trip out to Vegas to see Sergio, the first one I went a couple months ago, and it's like threw me off like a lot driving out to Vegas for those 3.5, 4 hours. And that's not that much, but I was like so focused thinking about things. I spent the whole time in that position, and it actually ended up throwing me out pretty bad, which actually I'm going to show myself as an example of an AIC pattern in a second. Working at a desk, this is another time that I really jack myself up. So I don't even work at a desk. I'll just be using my laptop on my couch, and I'll just be gangster leaning over to that side. And I'm like, oh man, not even realizing it because I'm so focused on what I'm doing. So awareness can be really big. Another thing is like crossing your leg, like a lot of ladies, but some guys too. A lot of times just cross that left leg, and that's gonna be way more comfortable, but that's going to reinforce the AIC patterns. A lot of times we'll be standing and we'll just be shifted all over on the right side. Sleeping is actually a huge one for me, and it's big for Sergio. It's big for a lot of people. What I tend to do when I sleep is I lay on my side, like say I'm on my right side, I'll end up like turning my left hips and left knee so far over that it's like almost like my crotch is on the bed, and then my torso is facing up. I'm totally contorted, rotating my hips so much if I'm not aware. That's how I'll end up getting into a car. So literally, you can see so many things can influence whether we stay in our pattern or not. Even how you do the horizontal mambo. So I don't know, this is just hilarious to me. I'm sitting there, I'm in class with, I brought my 3 trainers with me and I put us through this pelvis restoration course for PRI. And we're in there with all these like doulas and pelvic floor therapists. And I'm just scrolling through the book, I'm going to the appendix and I come across this and I just start giggling. I text it to my trainers and we're in there, we're just like little fucking children, but this was so funny to me. So apparently you can fuck yourself out of a left AIC or a pec pattern actually. And so it looks like right here, we're fucking ourselves out of a pec pattern. We've got lumbar flexion. I don't know who's fucking the pec pattern out of who. It looks like she's getting it. He could be going in extension. So I think she's the one with the pec pattern, getting that lumbar support. So, I mean, this is probably a left AIC one. You can see he's got the right side lengthened. Makes sense. And they actually go pretty in depth with it. There's multiple pages of this. Yeah, that's pretty hilarious. And then this one's definitely like the pec pattern people. So it's like got the foot support, which is funny because I actually, you'll see later, I recommend doing this kind of stuff for like pec pattern if you're working out, like having your feet up like that and stuff. So yeah, what kind of weirds me out is I know the creators of this and I don't really want to picture them doing this. And I also think it's funny, it's like, do you like test and retest after this? Like you go on the table and be like, okay, my right side has no external rotation. Let's fuck in this position. All right, now I've got external rotation. There we go. So I don't know. I think that's kind of silly and maybe one of the only ways to bring a little bit of humor to this subject because this stuff's about to get boring. All right, so let's look at some left AIC presentations. And again, why does this stuff matter? Because if it gets to the point where you're stuck in there, you're going to have muscle imbalance. It's going to affect your aesthetics, but you're also going to get injuries and have to like take time off or scale down the intensity, which we don't want to do. That's going to keep us from making gains. So probably like the most well-known left AIC bodybuilder is Jay Cutler. And it also goes to show you how it's not the be-all, end-all. Like you can still present like this and be a good bodybuilder, but this was like a big critique that Jay had throughout his career. He was pretty asymmetrical in his legs, and his back, and a few things. So if we look at Jay, what we're going to see with most left AIC pattern people is we're going to see a pretty overdeveloped left vastus lateralis, and that's because it's leveraged to be an internal rotator as well. And that's usually what will happen. It's not always what will happen, but I would say this is probably the most typical with like a left AIC bodybuilder. So we're going to see this left vastus lateralis way more developed, while this right adductor is going to be a little more meaty compared. And Jay also had really asymmetrical abs, and a lot of that has to do with your pelvic position. You can't really see the upper body issues as bad with this one, but we'll see those in a second. So in front relax, it's actually pretty easy to hide the brachial chain issues. But whenever we start posing, they kind of come out a little bit. So what you'll see is pretty much always a little bit more of a left lat flare on most poses from the front. That's because that right lat is really tight. It needs to be inhibited in a left AIC pattern. And again, you can kind of see just how much more developed this right adductor is. And I would also say on Jay, you can also present with a little more developed left tricep as well, which is not uncommon. All right, so here we have a good example of the left ribs flaring more and being able to present more of this lat. On a front double bicep, if you have a left AIC pattern, that left lat is always going to flare more. And again, you can see the vastus lateralis difference and the adductor difference. Turn it around, and now it's kind of the opposite story. That right lat will appear more dominant, that right side of your upper back. And you'll see a lot of bodybuilders with this. This is not unusual. At a high level, this is about as bad as it'll get. But you go to an amateur show, you look at some amateur pictures, you see people present like this all day long. You're not going to become a super high level bodybuilder if you can't be aware of what's going on. And most of these bodybuilders are aware. And it makes sense that Jay would present as a left AIC versus a pec pattern, because remember, pec pattern comes from producing like tons of force, from getting like really close to failure and having to use like orientation patterns to help you move the weight. Jay was a high rep guy. He was really conscious of things. He talks about like really trying to stay flat on a bench so you feel your pecs, so he's not flaring, not arching. Makes sense that he would be more lateralized than extended. If you're somebody who really pushes super hard past failure, like low volume, chances are you're gonna be more pec pattern. If you're a power lifter, you have to be pec pattern. And just another shot where you can see that's not just a one-off. on a lot of his shots, that right lat is going to be a little bit more dominant looking over there. And again, this is like a fault. Like, this is Mr. Olympia, but this is why he was so criticized. Like, Jay didn't get a lot of love till after he retired. People thought he was pretty shitty Mr. Olympia, actually. Here's Ronnie. He also presents like that. And it obviously did get worse as he got later in his career because of the nerve damage, but that was always an underlying thing. Here's just a picture of Tonio. And again, you're going to see that left lat flaring. That is always going to be really common. It's not a huge deal. It doesn't throw off the whole thing, but if you're looking like dead even with somebody else and they look symmetrical, they're going to give them the nod. All right, so I told you how I went up to see Sergio and I drove for a while and I was like, I think I ended up not drinking enough water, got a little dehydrated. I went and did legs like as soon as I got to Vegas, right after I got out of the car, which was dumb. I went to Torture Gym and I used that hack squat that Milos is always rambling on about how it's the greatest machine of all time. If you ever see him talk about that on IG, it's bullshit. I fucking hate that machine. Sergio does too, but I was doing it and like I got lateralized and my whole body spasm. And then, like I talked about earlier, there's a polyarticular muscle chain. So it's not like just like one thing spasm. It's like everything got like fucking tight together. I had like 10 things spasm and freak out. I actually was doing check-ins this day. And so here I am. And this is a super classical presentation of left AIC. And you can see why I would be doing pretty shitty on stage if this is how I was walking around. So I'm presenting more in my upper, but you can see how like much more flared out that is. Like my right side is really short. Like, I just look crooked as fuck. And you look at the back. Look how crazy this is. So you always have like a high left shoulder, high right hip. Again, that was really spazzed out. My trapezius were going really crazy. Super crooked. That lat's really flaring a lot more. You're going to see it a lot more on the front lat as well. And so, yeah, and then on the right, you're going to see a lot more of that. So I was like kind of bummed. I didn't like this. I just started working with, this is when I was working with Blue actually. I just started working with Blue and I was like, shit, I promise I'm not this like fucked up looking. I'm just spazzed out. And so later that day, I took pictures at night after I had done a lot of these moves I'm going to show you in a second. And you can see the imbalance was a lot better, not nearly as big of a left lat flare there. And I'm not like crooked and weird looking either. I'm like more up and down. You can see the lat spread here is a little bit more even as well. And then here, not nearly as crazy looking. I still am like a little shortened on this right lat side. I can see it's not popping out as much, but that looks so much better than whenever I was just sitting here crooked right here with this left shoulder so high. And that's still an issue. Like when I'm posing with Kenny Wallach, he tells me, he goes, drop that left shoulder. Like it'll end up getting there as I'm like really flexing, going hard. All right, so let's take a look at Nick Walker real quick too. So Nick actually doesn't present that bad up top. He doesn't have the craziest brachial chain pattern, which can make sense. It's a little easier like to think about like your ribs and be a little more engaged with your belly and just to be aware what's going on. It's a little harder with our pelvis and our foot setup. And I actually have seen Nick many times like have his feet set up completely different and wonky on like a leg press. So, I mean, one of his biggest critiques is his asymmetrical legs, and he could fix that issue if he did some of this stuff. So, super overdeveloped left vastus lateralis, right adductors. Like, he's a great example of that. That left vastus lateralis is way more overdeveloped. So, we're looking to find bodybuilders that have a really strong pec pattern presentation. It's not really easy to find high level bodybuilders that do that because it just doesn't make the best presentation. So one IFBB pro that has a crazy pec pattern, and it's because he's primarily a power lifter, is Stan Efferdine. So if we look at Stan right here in this picture, we can just really see how compressed that rib cage is. Just squish front to back. That's why it's so wide. We have that flare right there. But we don't see as crazy asymmetry in the legs necessarily. We're a little more symmetrical, but we are really just going to be missing out on a lot of the aesthetics because of this. So let's look at his front double. And again, you can just see something just looks weird, right? It doesn't look like most bodybuilders, and that's because, as I said, he's primarily a power lifter. So he's got to create crazy compression forces. And this is that compressed. Look, this is that rib cage. I'm going to break this out every single chance I get to make it worthwhile. You can see just visually, he's like squished, flattened out like that. You know, he doesn't have that cylinder kind of look to him. And like I said, you're not going to present with very good lats if you have this pec pattern. You're not going to present with very good medial delts either. And let's look at a back shot. Lots of thickness, lots of glutes, but we're not seeing tons of hamstrings. We don't see any quad sweep from the side. And we actually don't see like lats. So this looks like a powerlifter that got shredded. And one thing that these people with pec patterns will display is a pretty good rear lat spread oftentimes, because usually they've got super thick erectors and trap muscles. So sometimes this is actually a really good pose for them. And you can see here, this is an example of like just no delts at all, no flaring lats. And it's interesting because Stan is strong as fuck, squats a shit ton, but does not have the best quads. And that's something you'll see pretty often with pec pattern, not all the time, but pretty often the actual quads won't be that developed, whereas the adductors and glutes will be. And just another shot of where you can see like not a lot of delts. Obviously this isn't a bad physique, but he just presents, like I would look at him, I would know right away, oh, that guy lifts some heavy weight. He not just because he's so dense, but because of the amount of compression he's walking around with too. Another classic pec pattern is good old Dr. Mike. That's why his front lat looks so shit. You'll never see someone with a pec pattern have a very good front lat because they're almost always going to be lacking internal rotation, and you really need that to be able to get those lats to pop out. You know, this is by far Dr. Mike's worst pose, and most of his poses are shit, so that's saying something. But like I said, a lot of times these guys have decent rear lats, and that is by far Dr. Mike's best pose. But again, we're going to see no kind of like lateral delts, and also a lot of the times on these guys you won't see pec striations, pec details at all either, and that's because they're pressing from this extended position. They're not able to get any real contraction out of their pecs. And here we see this back double, really same thing, no width on this, just kind of thickness, not the most aesthetic at all. So a lot of times people with pec pattern, they also just don't have the best separation between their muscles and best details either. All right, so how do we know where you fall? Are you pec pattern or are you left AIC? Well, like I said, you're gonna be pec pattern. 95+% of you are gonna be pec pattern, so just know that going in, but you will slowly take away some of those compensations, you might fall into left AIC pattern. So these are the tests that I would recommend that you do. This is the standing shoulder flexion test. You wanna go against the wall, not actually all the way against it, be like 5 inches away with your heels, and you're going to reach up with that palm facing you. And I would say if you can't get your fingertips on the wall at all, then you're definitely pec pattern. I mean, a lot of you guys might not even be able to get to like past 90 without wanting to like go into extension. You're definitely pec pattern. But if you can't get those fingertips on the wall behind you, that's a good sign you're in pec pattern. So got them on, and I'm seeing how high they'll go. Like I said, you got to be aware that you're not compensating through extension. So you're also, if your elbow turns out a lot, that's not so good either. So I'm actually presenting pretty bad here on this day. Now, if you're presenting with a left AIC pattern, this right side is going to be easier than the left. And you can see the right is a little straighter. My left, the elbow starts to flare a little bit more. And that's because I don't have quite the external rotation, and I'm also more compressed on the left side. So that's kind of indicative of a left AIC pattern there. So the next test I'm showing is a straight leg raise. So 80 degrees or so. If you're a pec pattern, your straight leg is either gonna be really bad or really good. It'll be fake if it's good. So sometimes these people are so dumped forward with their pelvis, like we're on the table, right? So we have such an anterior tilt. You put that on the table, as we lift up that leg, you have room to move back into, because we got so much space there. So a lot of times these people will present with a good straight leg and it's not good. Sometimes they'll present with real terrible. If you're pretty far in a pec pattern, it'll be pretty bad. And when I say bad, I mean like less than 45 degrees. So I would say if you're less than 45 or you're more than 85, 90, you're probably in a pec pattern. We're gonna do bent knee hip flexion. So if pec pattern, you're probably not gonna be able to get to even 90 at all, probably 80. Then let's look at the shoulder. So I'm gonna look at my ER. I'm gonna be able to go all the way down there. Let's look at my IR, about 45, 50, 55, 50 degrees. So if you're in a pec pattern, you're gonna have pretty poor internal rotation. That is a test that your body's gonna have a harder time faking. External rotation, it might be able to fake. So you can't really use that to tell necessarily. But if you've got like less than 30 degrees, less than 20 degrees of internal rotation, you're definitely pec pattern. And now we go to the left side, straight leg raise, not as good, maybe like 75 to 80 degrees. Bent knee, about the same, maybe a little better. Now look at this. When I throw my left hand down into external, I really want to go into extension in my back and flare those ribs up. So I don't have quite the external rotation on my left side as I do on the right. Internal, about the same. So if you're presenting in an AIC pattern, you're gonna have better straight leg on the right and better bent knee on the left, better external rotation on the right, and better internal rotation on the left. So you can see some of my stuff is looking like pec, some of my stuff is looking like left AIC. All right, so now we're gonna look at some rotation of the hips. So there's my external rotation, and it was quite shit this day. This was terrible. I didn't try to like get good for you guys. You know, I'm doing so much more cardio than I normally do, which is 0. So, and I'm posing so much. I don't quite have the time for the mobility. I'm going to really do that this upcoming week, my peak week, so I can make sure that I can present my physique to the best of my abilities. But right now I'm lacking the mobility training. So this is really terrible, actually. I'm even deviating to the outside. I mean, this is a pretty bad external rotation. We're looking at like 40 degrees maybe. And then we go IR, maybe 10, 15 degrees there. Yeah, I had to check that one more. Maybe 45 there. And let's say 15 on there. And then we'll check the left side. A little better external. And my internal's actually presenting pretty good on the left, which it normally doesn't. And so for me, that shows me that it's a bad thing. Internal rotation of your shoulders is a really good test. It's hard to lie. Internal rotation of your hips, you can kind of lie a little bit. And that's because as we start to dump forward and turn a little bit, we hit this extension of our spine more on the left side. And that actually opens up space for internal rotation of the femur, just because we have more of an orientation of the sacrum forward. So if you have better internal rotation on your left than your right, good chance that it's fake and it's coming because you're so extended in the back of the left side of your back. As you pull that back a little bit, that should actually become more asymmetrical. So again, I'm presenting pec in some ways. The fact that my IR was pretty similar. But if you are in a pec pattern, you're most likely going to be pretty limited internal rotation on both sides. Unless you're early in the pec pattern, because as you start to move forward, you open up space for internal rotation. But as you continue to move forward in space and your center of gravity moves forward, like the lower musculature on the back side of your pelvis starts to get really tight, and that starts to limit your internal rotation as well. So you kind of lose external rotation as you start to tip forward, you gain a little internal rotation, and as you continue to go forward, you lose both. So that's where most of you guys will be in a pec pattern. But just remember, it can be fake on the IR. Here's another test. This is a knees together, falling to the side. And you can see mine are going pretty far to the right. What I'm paying attention to is these left ribs. I'm making sure that like they're not starting to flare like crazy or my back's starting to come off. Once it wants to do that, then you're done. So when I go to the left, I'm starting to get my whole body to turn a little bit. So I have better hit knees to the side on the right side. And that's pretty indicative of left AIC. Again, think about the turn of the pelvis, right? So boom, boom, I'm turned that way. Makes sense that my knees are gonna go that way easier. I'm already here. Going to the left, I'm gonna be a little bit limited. Again, that test shows you if you're oriented. It doesn't necessarily show if you're exactly in an AIC pattern. A lot of pec pattern people are gonna have the same results on that test. And then we have cervical rotation. This is a big one. Look how easy I go to the right. And then when I turn to the left, like I'm way worse. So that's actually a really good test to see if you're in a left AIC pattern. And if you're in pec, that'll be pretty limited both ways, close to equal. All right, so this test is really good. I didn't include like a lot of table tests because I know not everyone has access to tables, but if you do for this one, this is really, really good because as I've shown you, some tests can kind of lie. You know, your internal rotation of your hips can kind of lie, your straight leg can kind of lie, your bent knee hip flexion can kind of lie, your external rotation of your shoulders can lie, your external rotation of your hips can even kind of lie. But this one, your body can't lie on because this is a bony blockage. So what you want to do is you want to get to the edge of the table and let your left arm hang off. And I'm just kind of letting it fall. And I'm trying like to push it down even more to see what it feels like. And I feel like I'm hitting a wall. When I go to the right, look how much lower it is. It's way lower. And when I push down, it goes. It's like spongy. I don't feel like I'm hitting an osseous blockage where it won't move. It actually goes and just is like tight because it's at the end range. And so if you're presenting in a left AIC, you're going to be just like this. That right side is going to fall a lot more easily. And that's because the sternum is shifted to the right. And so where that humeral head sits in there, it's got more space to go out there. On this side, it's going to be really limited. It's going to hit that bone. So this is a really, really good test to see where you're at. And if you're in pec pattern, they'll both be pretty limited. Your pecs will both be really tight. You may want to inhibit your left pec, which I'll show you in a second before you do this test, because that could give you like a false positive too. All right, so this last test is a tricky one, and most people in my field would not recommend me saying this to you, but I do it myself, so I'm just going to present it to you. If you feel like you're comfortable with it, go for it. If not, then don't worry about it. So this is a active Ober's test. So typically you want to do this passive and have somebody do it for you. There is an active test that we do as well, and so I'm kind of doing this on my own, but it's really tricky because you can really lie to yourself. So I'll show you what I'm talking about. So what you want to do on this is just barely pick up the knee, move it straight back, and then just let it go, let it hang. And so my leg is hanging straight up right there. That is an osseous blockage. If I was in a better pelvic position, that would fall down like all the way to the ground, okay? Or at least it would go down close to the ground. But it's really easy to mess this up and to get a false positive, because all you have to do, again, this is really good. I didn't really move it at all. I brought it straight up. Okay, now this is how you can mess it up. If you lift up the foot and internally rotate, you're going to clear the osseous blockage and it's going to go down. So you can give yourself a false positive if you do that. So keep it level as it goes back. Now my right side typically will fall, and it fell a little bit, but not that much. Definitely didn't clear all the way. Here's an example of, again, cheating, going through a little bit of internal rotation. Now it'll fall all the way. And you see it's a lot more subtle on the right side because I don't need as much space to clear. I'm almost there already. So now it'll fall all the way if I do that. So let's do one more clean test. Up. Yeah, that wasn't even clean. Up, straight back. This one probably hang pretty decent. I'm still turning in a little bit. So the right goes a little bit easier, but not a lot. And so if neither of those go, that's usually a pec pattern presentation. Typically my right side will drop down better. So let's review these tests again real quick. So the best ones to show you if you're in a pec pattern are going to be internal rotation of both shoulders is going to be limited. Internal rotation of the hips is likely going to be limited, maybe not though. So that's a test to look at, but there is a chance to get a false positive on that. Although I would say like 90+% of you can use that pretty reliably. The shoulder abduction test is money. You cannot fake that one on the table. So if you are pretty limited in both of those, that's pec pattern. Because again, remember what happens as you go into pec pattern, both sides become more like the left. Left's more flared, the right's gonna fall flared. The left rib's more flared, the right rib's gonna fall a little more flared. So as we get further in the pec, the right side's gonna resemble the left a little bit more on most things. And then the cervical rotation is actually a really good one as well to tell if you're in pec pattern, because it'll be limited both ways. And then if you're comfortable doing the active Ober's test, if both knees aren't going down at all, then you're definitely in pec. If you can't get in the position at all, you're definitely in pec. Now to see if you're in a left AIC, you're going to have asymmetrical things. Again, they might not all hit the same checklist. You should have better straight leg raise on the right side, better bent knee hip flexion on the left, should have better internal rotation on the right. Again, sometimes for left AIC, that can be tricky because the left side dumps forward a little more. You might have fake IR on that side, but typically you have more IR on the right. On the hips, more ER on the left in the hips. Cervical rotation will be easier to the right than the left. In the upper body, typically right shoulder internal rotation will be worse, and left shoulder external rotation will be worse. And the left arm won't hang as far off the table as the right if you do the shoulder abduction test. And if you do the active Ober's test, the right side should clear or come closer to clearing than the left. All right, so this video was starting to get a little bit long. It was over an hour, so I'm gonna go ahead and split this into two. So this first part, we'll stop here, and so this just covers what the basics of a left AIC and pec pattern are, some examples, and how to tell which camp you fall into. So the next video is going to cover the positional drills you would do to kind of help fix these issues, how you might warm up, and some training considerations to take into account depending on which pattern you fall in. So I also plan on making a third video, and on that one we'll actually do a full workout for each individual pattern. So all right, thanks a lot. Look for part 2, and then part 3 should be coming in a couple weeks. Thanks.